So, a prominent political activist gets shot. At first glance, it looks like a tragic, but sadly, a pretty straightforward political event. But then, investigators start digging, and the motive? It just seems to dissolve into this weird cloud of internet jokes and video game references. Okay, we have to dive into this because what happened here is a huge, startling signpost for a world that honestly, a lot of us are struggling to get our heads around.
And that brings us to the central, baffling question for today. What in the world do video games and online trolling have to do with a political murder? I mean, this is what everyone is asking. The shooting of conservative activist Charlie Kirk has left pretty much everyone, law enforcement, journalists, you name it, completely scratching their heads. How do you possibly connect an act of real-world violence to a digital culture that, let's be honest, seems totally nonsensical on the surface? Well, the first clue is right there in the evidence. This wasn't some traditional political manifesto. Nope. The bullet casings were engraved with these bizarre in-jokes and gaming slang. Even the alleged shooter himself texted that it was all mostly a big meme. That's the disconnect we need to unpack. The horrific act on one side and this seemingly trivial motive on the other. It's a huge clue that maybe, just maybe, we're looking at this whole thing the wrong way. So to even begin to make sense of this, we have to zoom out. We need to look at the bigger picture. And that picture shows this massive cultural chasm opening up between generations. Look, if you've ever found yourself scrolling through social media and just felt completely lost, like you've landed on a different planet, you are not alone. There's a real reason for that feeling of being, disorientedly out of touch. The digital world has basically evolved its own languages and its own cultures at a speed that humanity has just never seen before. And believe it or not, this feeling actually has a name: generational discontinuity. And we're not just talking about a simple generation gap here, like arguments over music or clothes. This is way deeper. It's a fundamental breakdown where different age groups are essentially living in separate realities. They have separate rules, separate languages, and totally separate ways of making sense of the world. And this divide, it's getting wider. Why? Because the very foundations of a shared culture are crumbling. We're losing that common ground. We're losing a common vocabulary. And that leads to these wildly different lived experiences, and ultimately these deep growing chasms between how different generations see the very same world. Okay, so if we're ever going to bridge this divide, we're going to need a translator, right? We have to decode this new language of the internet, especially the really complex and, let's face it, confusing world of Gen Z's humor. So think of this next part as our Rosetta Stone.
This quote from Albert Erdogan really hits the nail on the head. Understanding this kind of humor isn't just about being in on the joke. No, it requires a deep, deep cultural competence. Without that context, a really layered, ironic statement just sounds like a lie, or, well, complete and utter nonsense.
All right, let's start with a key term you need to know: meta-irony. And this is where things get really tricky. Basically, it's being ironic about being ironic. The humor comes from the ambiguity itself. The whole point is that you're not supposed to know if the person is being serious or not. The goal is to completely blur that line. And that brings us to our next term, shitposting. You can think of this as meta-irony in action. It's the art of posting stuff that is just aggressively, ironically, and nonsensically bad on purpose. The goal? Well, it could be to derail a conversation, provoke a reaction, or just embrace the chaos for the lulz. For the laughs. Now, believe it or not, underpinning all of this is a classic philosophy: absurdism. This is the idea that we, as humans, are hardwired to search for meaning and purpose. But we live in a universe that offers us absolutely none. And that conflict, that tension between our desperate need for meaning and the cold, silent universe, that's what philosophers call the absurd. And the famous philosopher Albert Camus? He argued that we shouldn't fall into despair because of this. Instead, he said we should embrace it. We should find a kind of freedom in that meaninglessness, live fully in the present, and even draw strength from our indifference to some grand cosmic purpose. And that brings us right back to today. For a generation that grew up surrounded by political instability, economic uncertainty, and frankly, existential threats, this isn't just a joke. Embracing the absurd through things like shitposting and meta-irony becomes a coping mechanism. I mean, if the world itself feels totally senseless, why should your response to it be any different? But here's where the story takes a really dark turn. Because a culture that's built on ambiguity and a rejection of meaning, Well, that's fertile ground for something far more sinister. This is the point where so-called harmless jokes can curdle into truly dangerous ideologies. See, extremist groups and the alt-right in particular have become absolute masters of this language. They've figured out how to use the protective camouflage of irony to smuggle in some truly hateful ideas. They weaponize that ambiguity to radicalize young, impressionable people who might not even see it happening. And this radicalization, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens through this subtle, insidious pipeline. Step 1. It starts with edgy, oh, it's just a joke kind of humor. Step 2. Extremist ideas get mixed in, wrapped up in ambiguous memes. Step 3. If anyone calls it out, they just hide behind plausible deniability. Hey, I was just being ironic. Step 4. Over time, this desensitizes the audience to shocking content. And finally, step 5, it creates these toxic echo chambers that can, and absolutely do, spill over into real-world violence. And please understand, this is not a theory. It's a horrifying reality. As Ritwik Shivnati points out, we have seen the results. In these dark corners of the internet, mass murderers aren't condemned. No, they're turned into saints and martyrs. Violence gets gamified. It becomes a sick competition for a higher body count, all celebrated through memes and inside jokes. And this isn't just happening in one place. This kind of radicalization is thriving in all sorts of online spaces. You've got the anonymous, unmoderated forums like 4chan and 8kun, of course, but it also bleeds into mainstream platforms like X and Reddit, and even hides in plain sight within gaming communities on Steam and Discord. Okay, so this problem can feel completely overwhelming, right? Like we're dealing with an entirely new world with rules none of us understand. But it's not hopeless. The sources we're looking at for this explainer actually point to some clear, actionable ways we can start to bridge this digital chasm. So the big question is, how do you fight an ideology that hides behind a joke? What can actually be done? Well, the path forward really seems to be a two-pronged approach. First up, education. We absolutely have to teach digital media literacy and start it from a young age. We need to give young people the critical thinking tools to see through the so-called irony and identify the harmful ideology hiding underneath. And the second prong, we have to strengthen our real-world communities. Healthy, in-person social connections. They build empathy and provide the real sense of belonging that these extremist online groups only pretend to offer. When you boil it all down, what this really requires from us is a dose of humility and a whole lot of curiosity. Especially for older generations, it means we have to admit what we don't know. It means making a sincere effort to learn the language of this new digital world, not so we can become experts, but so we can understand the kids who are growing up inside of it. And that leaves us with one last big question. In a world that's built on irony, where our culture, our humor, and even our acts of violence are wrapped in so many layers of it that nothing feels real anymore, how do we find our way back? How do we get back to sincerity, to meaning, and to a reality we can all share? That, right there, is the challenge that events like this shooting force every single one of us to confront.